Welcome to today's webinar. It's the second of our All Pupils Every Ambition campaign. My name is Hannah Stolton and I'm the Chief Executive at Governors for Schools. I'm also a Chair of Governors in Essex. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar and also slides after the session, so they'll be emailed out to all attendees and also those who cannot attend. Closed captions are available. You can just switch them on through the options at the bottom. And there is the opportunity for us to put questions to our speakers today. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll endeavour to get to as many of them as possible. So our campaign, All Pupils Every Ambition, is about getting people who care about giving all pupils the chance to reach their ambitions onto school boards. It looks at how all governors can help young people in our communities succeed in all areas of their lives. In order to support you and me to do this, today's webinar will consider the steps governors can take to ensure that schools support all pupils to meet their potential. We're delighted to welcome two expert speakers. First of all, we'll hear from Rebecca Montague. Rebecca is a Senior Research and Policy Manager at the Sutton Trust, an organisation I'm sure you'll all be aware of. The foundation conducts agenda setting research, policy advocacy and evidence-based programmes to improve social mobility. Rebecca has researched and authored reports for them in this area. She's a school governor herself at a school in Greenwich, and she'll share insights into the disadvantage gap and the adverse effect of COVID on this problem. After Rebecca, we'll hear from Ellie. Ellie Cheshire is Product Manager for Governance at the Key Services. Ellie works to provide governors with the tools they need to do the job. She grows their skills and evidence their efforts. With a decade of experience working in governor support, Ellie is also Vice Chair of Governors at a primary school in Buckinghamshire. Ellie will be sharing insights and suggestions about what we should be thinking about as governors in relation to supporting all pupils to meet their potential. As I said, please do put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom, but without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca to hear from her.
No, 1 second, and I will just pop it to actually show you. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and thanks so much to everyone for coming along and giving up probably your lunch break to come and listen to this today. So I'm going to be chatting about some of the research that we've done, looking at the impacts of the pandemic on all school children, but specifically looking at the impact on those from kind of low-income families and more deprived homes. And then a bit of conversation about what school governors can particularly do to think about this going forward. So first off, I thought I'd give a really quick bit of intro on kind of social mobility as an issue in the UK and the Sutton Trust kind of core mission. So we look at social mobility starting from the very early years, very young children, and we know that they're actually already many months behind their better off peers before they even start at school. So this is a problem that's there from the very start of their journey to education. We also know that through the actual time in the school system, they have very different experiences in terms of the resources available to them, the kind of teachers available to them. And we know that high performing comprehensive schools actually take in half the number of poorer pupils than the average. And they actually look different even than their kind of wider area. So there are issues there around who has access even within the state system to what resources. All of these inequalities then actually lead to differences in outcomes. So we know disadvantaged students are twice as likely to leave formal education without GCSEs in English and maths than compared to their better off classmates. Then in terms of what happens for their next steps, we know, and research we've done has found that 8 top schools actually end up sending as many pupils to Oxbridge as 3/4 of all other schools. So most of those are top private schools, but not all of them. Some of them are state schools. But the actual outcomes for students really do differ by the kind of schools that they attend and the kind of resources they have access to, as well as obviously their kind of home experiences and background experiences. And all of this then means that the people who end up then in the top jobs in the country, because obviously your education has a big kind of impact on what you go on to do, are themselves much more likely to be from better off backgrounds. So Britain's most influential people, we've kind of looked at top roles across mostly civil society, politics, sport, all of the kind of big things we think about in the public sphere. they're over 5 times more likely, those individuals, to have been to a private school than the average person in the population. And if you're born into a wealthy family, you're more than 2.5 times more likely to end up wealthy yourself. So that was all before the pandemic, and what we were kind of working with is the start state of play before any of this happened. But obviously the pandemic will have had big impacts all across society, including on this problem. So, and as I mentioned, just in terms of the Sutton Trust mission, we've covered the early years all the way through to kind of access to higher education, apprenticeships in the workplace, and all that happens in between in terms of schools being able to go into lower level apprenticeships and everything in between. So we've looked at all of these kind of areas in our research on COVID to look individually at each of them, what is the impact of the pandemic been, especially on the poorest. And I'll just point out to you some of the research pieces we've done looking at schools specifically. I'm going to talk through in this presentation some of the research then specifically from some of these pieces, but I thought it would be useful just to flag them in case you want to go away and have a bit more of a look at this in detail after. So we started looking at this right from the very beginning and the first lockdown. And in April 2020, we put out our first impact brief, looking at the impact of that set of school closures. So at that point, what access did people have to devices? What kind of work were schools setting for pupils? What were some of the kind of first initial issues? And I think that's quite useful to go back to now to know in that first lockdown, what were pupils actually experiencing and how did that differ across socioeconomic backgrounds? We also looked at A-level results and university access in 2020. So we looked at the system in place that year for the teacher assessed grades, what impact students felt that was having, the impact teachers felt it was having, and some discussion about what was likely at the time to happen with university entry. And again, that's just quite useful to have as kind of background context of what happened during the pandemic. Then in the second lockdown, we did it all again. So we again surveyed teachers to try to understand who had laptops, who had devices, what were kids struggling with at home, what was the kind of work that they were being given, and how much were they actually completing that work. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So if you want to see any of the stuff I show you today in more detail, go back and have a look at that report. Then we again looked at A-levels and what happened with those results in university access again this summer. Still getting very Groundhog Day. I'm hoping we're not going to have to do another lockdown one in January, fingers crossed this year. But basically looking at what happened with the actual set of exams that happened this year. Obviously, it was a bit different in how they were done than the year before. And what kind of impact is that likely to have, especially for the poorest young people? So do have a look back through those if you just want some general background information throughout the pandemic and what the impact has been in schools. So then looking at some of that data from those reports. So this graph combines data from when we looked in that first March 2020 lockdown, when we looked in January 2021. And we asked teachers what proportion of their class had access to the devices and an internet-enabled device they would need to be able to do learning remotely. So as you can see, there was an improvement from March 2020, where more people were likely to say that they were having really big problems, that lots of people didn't have devices. But actually, there were still lots of people that did not have access to the devices that they needed, even in January 2021. And while the government did do a rollout of devices during the pandemic, even we think right when kids were getting back to school again at the end of that lockdown in 2021, we think there were still kids who'd just never been given access to the device that they needed. So there will have been children who had really different experiences all throughout the pandemic. There'll be kids who the very first day, their parents were able to give them a device, sit them down in a room of their own, and set them straight off with learning that their schools were able to provide online from day one. And there will have been kids who were still really struggling right at the end of the second lockdown and their last time out of school, who still didn't have a laptop, who may have been able to go in at that point because children were allowed to go into their schools if they didn't have a device at home. But maybe for various reasons in their family, they weren't able to do so. Maybe their parents didn't feel comfortable sending them in, who could have missed many months of work in terms of what they were actually able to access. So really different experiences depending on the children who were involved. And looking at this in January 2021 for the type of school, on the far left, you can see private schools, teachers who teach in private schools. This is all secondary level. And then on the other side, you can see going through from the most affluent state schools, and this is based on the proportion of their students eligible for free school meals, through to the most deprived intake state schools, who had access to what devices. And you can see here that those in the most deprived state schools were much more likely to say that they still had lots of students who did not have access to those devices. And this was going into the very start of that January 2021 lockdown. So there will have been lots of students who just did not have access to the devices they needed to learn remotely. Then even on top of that, you've got the question of, even if they have a device, are they actually able to work? Do they have a quiet space that they can work in? Do they actually have a suitable space to study, or are they perhaps living in unsuitable housing conditions? Maybe also with younger siblings that they're trying to support. Maybe their parents don't have the ability to look after those kids in the day themselves, and they're having to take a lot of that on. So again, really, school acts, even though I've talked about the inequalities in schools, it still acts as a quite big leveler for young people, making sure that their experience is much more similar to other young people, even if what's going on at home can be quite different. And having the lockdowns basically took a lot of that away for young people and meant that they were much more exposed to what their home environment was, which for some of them would have not been a good environment to be able to work in. So this was asking young people what access they had to either the internet, the tech they needed, or a suitable space to study. And these are the people who said they did not have sufficient access. And actually, even above the need for internet access and access to tech, we found that many actual young people didn't have access to a space to study. And at the bottom, you can see ABC1 and CTDE. This is based on the social economic background of their parents. So ABC1 is kind of better off middle class, upper class families. CTDE is working class, perhaps out of work families, people who don't kind of have as a secure social economic position. And people in those families, young people in those families, were much more likely to say that they didn't have things like a suitable space to study. And that's something that unfortunately there just wasn't very much we could do about during the pandemic. Schools were reopened so they could let people back in to an extent in the second lockdown. But if there were reasons that families didn't want their kids to go in, that they still just didn't have the right living conditions for those students to be able to learn, there wasn't very much really that schools could do about that. And I think that does also pose big questions for public policy going forward. If so many kids are living in these sorts of situations, what is that doing for them when they're trying to do their schoolwork out of school the rest of the time when we're not talking about the pandemic? And the pandemic really has shone a light on a lot of existing inequalities in society. So what did this mean in terms of the learning people got done? Well, unsurprisingly, those from kind of poorer families were less likely to do as many hours of work per day as reported by their teachers. So here I'm showing the state-funded school versus private school split, but there were also differences across the kind of level of deprivation within state schools. But you can see for those in private schools, they were much more likely to say they were doing even more than 6 hours per day, 5 or 6 hours per day, whereas those in state-funded schools were more likely to have been learning for fewer hours. So that's risking exacerbating all of those existing inequalities I talked about at the beginning. And in terms of what work then being returned by pupils, those in more teachers in private schools were much more likely to say that they were getting lots of work back from their pupils, whereas those in deprived state schools especially were less likely to say that they were actually getting work being returned by their pupils, even if they were assessing it. This is again all data from the second lockdown. And in terms of the quality of work returned, those in more deprived schools, the teachers were more likely to say that they were getting a lower quality of work than they would normally expect before the pandemic, whereas that was less likely for those in kind of private schools, more affluent state schools. So in terms of that access to devices and having an impact on where they have to work, we're seeing that go through to, okay, what was the work they were actually able to do? So we asked teachers what they thought the impact would be on the attainment gap at the time. And as you might expect, those in kind of the most deprived intake state schools were the most likely to say that they were going to see a substantial increase in the attainment gap after this. Now, we're only just starting to get data to really understand how much this has been the case, like how much we are actually seeing changes in the attainment gap. And it's quite difficult because we haven't had a full set of proper sat down exams yet, that it's really difficult to really understand how big this problem is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and what governors can do about that in just a moment. So I'm just going to skip past this actually just for time wise, but I'll just mention a little bit on the early years and just say that this problem isn't only for school age children. people in the early years, preschool age children, have also been impacted by the pandemic. We asked primary school senior leaders what proportion of kids they thought was school ready coming into primary school in September 2020 compared to what they would normally expect before the pandemic. And lots of them were saying that it was higher than normal, the number of pupils who weren't school ready. And that was more likely in more deprived areas, that it would be higher than normal. So again, schools are seeing those pressures at that point as well. So we're trying to understand some more about this and this question of how big has the impact actually been. So the Sutton Trust, together with a host of other organisations from UCL, the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and it's all being funded by the ESRC, are looking at this question by doing quite a large long-term study of 12,000 young people who are in year 11 to follow them through their experiences of what happened to them in the pandemic and then what's going to go on to happen to them in terms of the grades they get, what happens to them at A-level, where do they go to university or other training, and what happens to them in the workplace. There's going to be the first reports from that coming out next spring, so keep an eye out for that, because this is going to be some of the best quality data we've got on exactly what the impact has been, at least for this specific age group, but it should give us a lot of learnings for other age groups as well. So in terms of what governors can think about going forward, I think during the winter, there's going to still be the issue of kind of ongoing absences because of COVID, because there are still lots of cases going on at the moment and people having to isolate because they've got COVID. So I think there are some questions governors can ask immediately around things like, does your school have the right kind of cover in place to be able to actually cover any absences for staff? Do you at this point have enough laptops and internet dongles for children to take home while they're isolating? And if not, are there any things that you could do and that governors could even do in their local communities to try to fundraise to make sure that you're getting those laptops to those kids? And also, what is actually happening to kids when they are remote? Are they being provided with work? And is anything being done to try to help pupils who are repeatedly missing time? So perhaps they have family who are shielding and they're really worried about that. They're taking a lot of time off of school because of that. Maybe they just happen to have gotten COVID a lot of times. Maybe they have a lot of siblings who are bringing it home all the time. So thinking about those kind of issues and what's being done for those students is kind of, I think, some of the immediate concerns. And I'd say on these and on education recovery, a lot of this is the kind of stuff that in my own school's governing board, this is what I've been kind of asking about. So I think some of the other issues you can really think about going forward on education recovery and thinking about that learning loss, part of it is, how is your school actually monitoring it? So lots of schools are kind of doing their own internal assessments to try to get a grip, because for each school's context, it's going to be different. And it's going to be different depending on that community, what they faced in the pandemic, the housing situation, all of those kind of things. So making sure your school is really doing those internal assessments to check who is falling behind, what support do they need, and what kind of support then is being put in place. So there have been catch-up funds been made available by government. It is less than we would have liked to have seen, but there is money available for schools to do catch-up efforts. The Education Endowment Foundation has some great resources on their website if you're looking for things that funding could be spent on. I'd say when you're looking at disadvantaged students specifically, a lot of it will be similar to what you generally think about in your pupil premium strategy, making sure that you've got good interventions with a good evidence base in place for those pupils, and also that you've got good quality teaching for them all the time, and using your pupil premium, thinking about using pupil premium to make sure that happens. I'd really encourage schools to make use of the National Tutoring Programme. I know there have been some problems with the initial setup in terms of, I think schools have sometimes been quite cautious in terms of getting those tutors in for the first time and maybe not having an established relationship. We have heard from lots of schools who have done it that they've really enjoyed it. The kids have really enjoyed it. So if your school isn't already doing it, I'd really encourage you to look at that. And also thinking really importantly, because we know kids from low incomes have been so impacted, how are your school's catch-up efforts and plans around that linking in with your pupil premium strategy that you already have in place? And can more be done to make sure that those two match up? So that's everything. Obviously happy to answer any questions today, and also do take down my email if you think of other questions later that you'd like to ask me, and I will do my best to get back to you on that as well.
Thank you ever so much, Rebecca. That was great. Really, really interesting. I think there was a slight problem with the sound. It was fine, we could hear you, but it was a bit wobbly, so apologies for that. We will now hand over to Ellie. So Ellie, are you good to share your slide?
I certainly am. Hold on 1 second. There we are. Are we all clear? Can everybody hear me all right? You never know until you start talking.
Never know until you start speaking. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, well, hi. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Ellie Cheshire and I'm Product Manager at the Key for School Governors and Governor Hub. This basically just means it's my job to make sure that we're giving the right people the right information at the right time. I'm also a governor. I'm a vice chair, soon to be chair at a primary school in Bucks. So what I want to do now, and Rebecca, firstly, that was so interesting, just absolutely amazing information, really helpful to see. What I'm hoping to do now for everybody listening is to kind of go back to, so what does that mean for governors and how should we be looking at this through the governance lens? This, and I'm holding my hands up here, folks. I've stolen this from a colleague of mine, this page, this slide. She used this in a talk about school recovery a short while ago. But I think it's really important to put this up now, as just as Rebecca's been talking about this recovery and catch up. I think our content lead, Linda, she said that a head teacher had described what happened to their school over COVID. It's almost as if he turned around and the school had just burnt down to the ground, gone. And actually, rather than recovery, this is about starting again almost and rebuilding. And I think just as with, if your house had burned down to the ground, it's never going to be built exactly the same again. It's going to always be, right, what do we need from ground up? Let's build it afresh with what we need. And I think with the recovery, with the changes that we've seen over the past year or two, or whatever it's been, is that this is about it's not getting back to how we were before, it's about helping our children with what they need now. Now, this hierarchy of needs I've got here is, and I hope you can all read it clearly enough, but really what this shows is what our children need right now. There's that base need, those psychological needs, and this, as I have admitted, this is a reused slide, so it's a little bit out of date, but it's really important to see that base need of our vulnerable children. Did we have school places for them? Did we get the food to those children, have free school meals? It was that real base need. They're basically saying, are our children, all our children, able to learn? Then, of course, on the next layer, you've got that, and how are they able to learn? Is it in a nice, safe and healthy way? Are we protecting our staff, our pupils? And so all of that, the masks and the bubbles and the one-way systems and the, whatever, we're making sure that our children are able to learn in a safe way. Then as you go up the pyramid, we're then talking about those social needs. And this was really important. This is about rebuilding those relationships, getting those routines back in place, or living with them when they're in and out of school. I don't know about you, but certainly lots of schools in my area had real trouble with behaviour when kids started coming back to school that had been at home for such a long time. This is just about, so what do I do in this situation? It's been so different. So those social needs really come into importance once we've got all those base needs in. Up the level again, we're moving now from knowing what to expect, from knowing how to behave, into actually feeling confident in what we do. Regaining lost learning is a strange thing. And again, holding hands up, my son was asked to go to an intervention for his English, and I'm like, oh well, that's great news, you can catch up all the stuff you've missed, and get really better at the stuff, all that sort of stuff. And actually he felt really bad about it, because he thought, well, I think I'm doing all right, it's not that I haven't been doing anything, it's not my fault. And actually that confidence in thinking that this is just part of life and it's okay, that's not necessarily there. And it's only after we've done all of this stuff that we're now at the top. Number 5, the school improvement bit at the top. And this is when we're talking about, attainment and progress and all those sorts of things. And I think as governors, it's quite often way too easy to just go straight to the top and worry about those aspects. What are those numbers doing? What are we doing about that? And actually not think to go back through those base needs. our children throughout our schools, whether we're a small village rural primary school or a huge MAT or whatever, our kids are spread throughout this hierarchy of needs. And so as governors, we've got to make sure that we're asking those questions. How, you know, what are you doing about this? How is this working? What's it like in your school? At the moment, I mean, it's autumn term. We've just rejigged our structure on our board. My new role for this year is inclusion governor. And I have to say, it seems to include just about every other role on the board. It's feeling like an enormous job at the moment. And, you know, the question, that the title of this, and forgive me, I can't see it on my slides. It's like, you know, how do we ensure, as governors, how do we ensure that every pupil reaches their potential? It's a long sentence and it's a big job. Right? That seems really quite large. And if you look at all the stuff on this chart, this is pretty much the inside of my head at the moment, you know, as I get to grips with this particular role. And it's too easy to think, right, there's this aspect, there's this aspect, there's this aspect. How do I do this and when do I do that? As governors, and again, it might look like I've sort of stolen this slide from an introduction to governance. I haven't, I've made this one myself, honest. As governors, really the crux of it is that we go back to the core functions of a governing board. Almost doesn't matter what role we're doing or what subject we're talking about. What matters is if we're doing these three things well, that is when all our pupils will move up that hierarchy. So clarity of vision, you know, do we all have the same view of our school? Do we all know where we're moving towards? Do we understand that sort of end game and what we're aiming for? Are we holding those leaders to account? Are we saying, well, why did you do it like that? What are you looking at when you do this? How, you know, what does that mean? You know, all those sorts of things. And obviously we need to make sure that money is being well spent. Rebecca talked about the catch-up fund, so important, the pupil premium funding, all these issues that we're looking at. Are we using them sensibly? Are we actually understanding what is happening in school and using those funds correctly? Now, it might seem a little bit of a cop-out to sort of, we've come here to talk about this specific issue, and I'm telling you about, you know, just the core functions of governance. But I really think whether you're a new governor and you just started in a role, or whether you're an experienced governor and you've been doing it for 25 years, if every time you're thinking, right, here's a new problem, you come back to these three core functions and you make sure that you're looking at these, then you can't go far wrong. As an example, let's go back to our hierarchy here. Let's think about our vision, our school vision. If you've got a school vision that says, yeah, we make sure your children can learn in school, well, that's great. Yep, there's a school place for your child, wonderful. If your vision is saying, well, we're aiming to not only to be able to teach your children, but we're going to do it really safely and we're going to protect them whilst we're doing that. Fab. Not only are we going to teach your children in a real safe way, we're going to make sure that they understand how to act in society. They're going to be able to build relationships and they're going to, you know, manage their self in the world around them. Fabulous, you know, we're talking, right? Well, actually, not only are we going to teach your children safely and we're going to teach them red tooth, we're going to make sure they feel confident about themselves. And when you get up to this level 4, I'd like to go to that school, right? The school that's aiming for those things right up to here is what we're talking about. And we haven't even started talking about whether they're outstanding or whether they've reached this attainment level. So again, if we could just go back to those basic things and say, right, where are our children on this level? Then I think, you know, that's really going to help us move. Something that I think as governors, maybe we don't do enough. We're talking about getting our children, whoever they may be, to reach their potential. And I think one thing we forget to do is quite often to look in the mirror. Have we, on our board, got the tools for the job? Have we got the right people around the table? And again, this is basic stuff. But unless we apply these basic rules to every issue we're looking at, then, you know, it just doesn't work. It doesn't move forward. So have a think on your board. When's the last time we did the dreaded skills audit? And actually, we might do it every year, but do we actually use it to improve the board? Do we find gaps and do we then fill them? Or do we just do it every year as part of our routine? Thinking about recovery, post-COVID, and looking at all the different things that have happened in your school, have you got the right structure and the right speed, the right pace on your board to be able to actually make these changes? School as you knew it, governance as you knew it, was obliterated, wasn't it, with lockdown? I mean, just can't really believe it happened when you look back. We're still in it, obviously, and just as Rebecca was saying, we could go in and out and in and out. We have to be ready for every eventuality. So do you have the pace to cope with that? We're restructuring on our board at the moment to try and make sure that we can really act on the issues that we're doing at the moment. We've got rid of our committees. We're doing a sort of circle model. Have a think about how you're doing things and what you need to impact in your school. And at the bottom there, who's championing these things? Who's actually taken on responsibility responsibility to ensure they know what's happening in your school? That's not to say, oh, that person's job is SEND, so I don't have to worry about it. The whole board need to know about it. But have you got someone that's going in there, taking a special interest and reporting back to the board so that you can discuss the issues that matter? Practical job here. I've got 3 big questions, and they are big questions. So, all you've got to do now is just pop back and answer these questions and you're fine. It's really important. I think the one on the left here, who are your stakeholders? Who are your pupils in the school? Who are your parents? What's happening for them? And what's happening for them now is most likely completely different to what was happening for them 2 years ago, let's say. If you're a new governor, the most important thing you can do is learn about your school, understand that unique context of your school. When the knock comes on the door and Ofsted are asking you to, talk about your school and your problems, they need to know that you know this school as itself, not as just a school. One thing you can do is you can look at your areas, think about social economic sort of factors. What are the barriers to learning that your particular set of pupils have? You might have a school that had a big work factory, or a really huge workplace that closed down in COVID, and you've got a load of parents that are actually now out of work, for instance, were different to before. You might have a transient pupil base. You might have forces children in and out, in and out, in and out. There's all sorts of things that happen that will be different and will mean that your pupils have different needs. I've put a little link in there for Governor Hub Insights. It's a free website for everybody. And on there, you can stick your school name in and it will come up and it will show you the economic data, like religions in the area, and data that just gives you a little bit of clue of where your pupils might be, as well as links to all sorts of other stuff. But it's just a nice place to start, especially if you're a new governor and you don't perhaps know the area. So when you really understand your pupils, when you know what's happening in their community that might affect them, we look at the barriers to learning. Do you have a high population of SEND, special educational needs pupils? Do you have particular needs? Are things growing? Are there extra aspects that seem to be changing? I know in my school, we've got a new head, and he was commenting on how there's quite there's almost like 2 different types of people in the school. And it actually took me by surprise, and because I know that generally we've got quite a homogenous group of people in our school, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, have I not noticed this change, because I'm just in it too focused, and I know my school, this is what they're like. Actually, it takes a new head to say, oh, this is a bit different, this isn't what I expected. Things change. Somebody once said that if you're in a room of governors that have been doing it for 20 years, you'll have some of the best governors in that room, to really learn from. You will also have some of the worst governors in that room, because actually they haven't changed with the times. They haven't noticed that things change. They don't look afresh every time. And especially now after COVID, looking afresh at things, starting anew, building up from the ground level is what we need to do. So once you've understood your pupils, then you need to understand actually what your pupils need. And it's not just about perhaps interventions that people need. It might be staffing structure. It might be, do you have teachers teaching the class and the TAs doing the interventions? Do you actually have the TAs looking after the pupils that perhaps are doing all right, and the teachers coming out of the class to do the interventions so they really have impact? Think about the way that your school is structured. assessment is a big thing. You know, we've got no data really, have we, at the moment? So just as Rebecca was saying, how is your school looking at data? What interventions are you using? You know, what are they suitable? Are they actually suitable for the particular needs of your school? And what adjustments are you making? Reasonable adjustments can, you know, for people in your school. I saw a really brilliant video of a Senko talking about a dyslexia-friendly classroom. Have you got a dyslexia-friendly classroom? And you know, and it's, you don't wait until you've got 3 or 4 people with dyslexia in your classroom to be able to do that. All classrooms should be dyslexia friendly. Why wouldn't they be? You know, and it's about just looking things through a different lens and say, well, what are we doing? Now, the one at the bottom here, culture. That's a real toughie, right? What is the culture in your school? We're trying to get all these different pupils to reach their potentials. So everything has to be embedded and threaded through. Your policies, do you have policies in place that cover all these sort of different angles and make sure that nobody is disadvantaged? And if you've got the policies, do you have them? Are they, you know, ticked off, you know, when they're reviewed? Or they actually really lived in school? Do you take those policies as governors, go on a learning walk at your school and say, right, how can I see this being lived? This says that we do this for our pupils. Where's the evidence to say that's actually happening? Where's the impact of this policy? Policy is the bane of a governor's life, right? When you start to actually see how they're lived, then they become not only important and valued and used and effective and impactful. Look at your staff CPD. How are they trained? Where are you getting your training from? If you're training on ADHD, for instance, is it sort of an ADHD society that's recommended this, that really understand the problem? You know, how is your school choosing which courses to do? And the thing about the culture as well is everybody feeling the same thing. I was a safeguarding governor, and I know as a governor, when you turn up at the school gates and you press your button and they see you and they know exactly who you are and what you're there to do, I'm always crossing my fingers that they still press the buzzer and say, can we help you? And so on, as opposed to just saying, come in, we know you. Because it just means that it's that safety isn't at the forefront and they just embedded in it, you know it. So it's the same when we're talking about disadvantage. Is everybody thinking the same thing? Is everybody looking for ways to make sure that nobody's at a disadvantage? There we go. So just now, in the next sort of, where am I? 5 minutes, I think. I just want to pop back to those 3 core functions and just to remind us about, from what we've talked about, what are we looking in each of these areas? A little quote down here: know your destination and focus on the journey. I always like to bring back things to the school, and this actually came home with my secondary school daughter, who's doing her GCSEs at the moment, and one of her teacher puts motivational messages in her classroom for the students, and I love it. She's always bringing them home. Oh, this was a good one, this was a bad one, and they're all talking about it. And it's just wonderful to hear stories about teachers that are trying to sort of cut through everything else, and just with it, you know, a little something like this. But I nicked it because I thought it was great for clarity of vision. It's a good one. So vision, this is your North Star, right? When you're making your decisions on your board, with that lens of, you know, who are we helping here? Are we making sure we're helping everybody in the way that they need it? Think about your vision that you have now. I do find it a little bit frustrating when boards seem to have a kind of one-size-fits-all vision, or a we're going to be outstanding. It always kind of makes me wither a bit inside. At the moment, if you're looking for attainment and progress as part of your vision and where you're aiming for, is that really an appropriate beacon for right now? You think about everything that's happened, you know, right now, think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Does everyone feel safe? You know, are we rebuilding those relationships? Where are we trying to get our children to? You know, we want to get them feeling confident and being off and running and not feel like they're somehow missed out, or they haven't quite made it, or they haven't done well enough. As for holding leaders to account, and we've covered a little bit, and I know Rebecca talked a bit about this, we don't necessarily have the data we always used to have, right? It used to be very straightforward, whereas now we're kind of like, well, where are we as a school? How are we going to know? How are we going to compare this? We can't compare it to the rest of the country right at the moment. Well, it's quite right, but it doesn't mean that we've either got to make it up, you know, or get our leaders to do something completely different. We've got to work with them. We've got to talk to our leaders about where is the school, where are our pupils, and how do you know that? And I think one way of doing this, click, no, I've gone too far, there you go, is thinking about how we're talking to our leaders and what questions we're asking. And I think the way things are at the moment, you might just have to reframe it a little bit. So what we've got, you know, instead of focusing on attendance, let's think about that engagement. Are pupils excited about learning, whether they're here, whether they're there, whatever's going on? Are they into it? Are they loving learning? Instead of perhaps thinking about progress, and I'm not trying to say progress is not important, because obviously it is, but let's thinking about the support they get. And let's think about all these children. Is everybody given that same opportunity to do well? We're talking about our staff. Are we thinking about necessarily productivity at the moment? Or are we actually thinking about the support and the skills they need to cope? You know, the amount of the change that they've been through over this past little while, not least just using technology. I mean, crikey, you know, that's tough. Historically, the very place that are teaching children to be able to cope in a modern world was the very place where technology was awful and nothing linked up or worked, you know? So actually having to switch that and use technology in the way they have is quite incredible. Parental engagement. We haven't talked about that a lot, and we could probably do a whole session on that quite easily. It's really important, but perhaps instead of saying, how can we get them engaged? Let's empower them to help. Let's give them the skills. Let's hopefully see our parents as allies. When you're talking about children with special educational needs, when you're talking about children that have been in and out of lockdown, we need to find out what's happening from those parents and actually use those experiences of our parents to help us. And again, look, what they need, they will get. If your children need something to be able to reach their potential, that must be what they get. And I think sometimes it's too easy for governors not to really push to understand what that is. And last of the three there, you're making sure your money's well spent. Obviously, this is important. Our finances is absolutely vital, but I want to just make sure the lens is that, again, that we're looking through our finances at. Thinking about how that money is spent in your school. Let's think about the relevance. Where is it going? What's important? What's most important? What's your vision saying? What is it that your children have lost out on? So therefore, where should that money be being spent? Evidence is key. You know, we've seen some amazing stats today, and I think evidencing is why are your teachers choosing this? You know, they've decided to put this whizzy new maths thing in. Why? Is it the one that somebody else has used? Have they seen how it worked? What they're expecting to happen? Where's the evidence to say this is the way forward? I think reinventing wheels just happens all the time, and this is the time to actually question, what are we doing? What worked before lockdown? That did it? Will it still work? Things are quite different now. Do we need something different too? And then you've got impact. No point in doing anything without the impact. So if you have spending your money in the right place and you've got the evidence behind it to say, yes, do it, what is the impact? What are you expecting to see, and when are you expecting to see it? And then when you get there, did you see it? And if not, why not? So I think whilst it is about the money and the finances, I think much more than that, it's about the questions we ask behind them. Last slide. There we are. We have to, last slide, the obligatory next thing to do. Got to go home with a job, right? Some homework. And I've brought you back to this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what I think, if throughout this, we know there are issues, I'd say really go back, think of your three core functions, your clarity, your accountability, the head and the money, and go through these and think about each of these areas. How well are you doing? Think about each of those core functions in each of these areas and think about where your pupils are. And I think if you can go back and do that, then you've got a really good chance of being able to really ensure that all of those pupils reach their potential. And that's it from me. I think I'm a minute short, so that's good.
That's brilliant, because we've got lots of questions. Thank you so much, Ellie. That was so much food for thought there to take away, definitely. Lots to take from and actions to take, I think. We did have a question just for you, Ellie, about the circle model in relation to structure. Can you just give us an overview of what that is, please?
Yeah, so the school I'm about to take on Cheshire for we need a real period of rapid improvement. So what we've done is we've removed committees. So we have all of us together as a full board. We meet monthly, so more meetings, shorter meetings. And then what we do is we have individual governors with roles assigned to our priorities, who then go and report back from the school in between. And what this does is it means that everybody's involved, everybody's focused, and we can bring about that rapid improvement, because we're saying 1 minute, right, we're talking about this is what needs to be done. Next time, where are we at with that? And then we rotate the content of the agendas to suit, so we can focus on an area each time. Mm-hmm. Look us up if anybody. My email is on there. If anybody needs to know about information, they can drop me a line. Hopefully that we do a whole session on that too.
Great, yeah, we could definitely. Thank you very much. We'll go back. I've got, as I say, lots of questions. Originally, we had a couple of comments about early years and the massive impact that it's had, obviously, on early years. Rebecca, I wondered whether there was anything in particular you wanted to say. People are saying things like it's having an impact on social interaction, speaking and listening behaviour. Is there key areas where you're seeing a negative impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reports I didn't mention, we have one called A Fair Start. I can link it in the chat if anyone finds it useful. And we've done some work there to ask, as well as asking about general school readiness, which exact areas is it that there are actually problems in the schools as kids have been going in. We're considering repeating it for this year as well, because this data is from kind of the last academic year. And yeah, it is all the things that you would expect around like social skills, communication, because it's not just that these kids have missed out on time that they might have been in, say, an early years kind of formal setting. It's everything. These are kids that were very, very young when they went into the pandemic, who will have missed out on going to the supermarket, maybe one parent went alone because of the pandemic. Maybe they didn't get to see their grandma or grandpa or wider family and friends that they would have normally interacted with. So I think it's really unsurprising that we have seen big impacts. And I think one thing we're concerned about at the moment is that there hasn't been that much of an emphasis on making sure that that age group have the help and support they need. We want to see it, I guess, across all age groups. And I think it's definitely something for schools to think about, because those are going to be the kids coming in.
Thank you. Yes, I think key point of concern, I suppose. Right, okay, other questions we've had are around children. I guess if we're still in the throes of COVID, it's not over by a long stretch, and schools are really struggling. So two aspects on that front. We're talking about recovery quite a lot, but actually we're still dealing with the problem. What can governors do to sort of, I suppose, support staff? There's obviously the well-being aspect that we're worried about, that staff have been through a lot themselves, and how we support their well-being, while also doing all of the other the three things that governors have to do. So how do we balance that act, I think? Who would like to come in? Ellie, did you want to come in? You're on mute.
Classic, left myself on mute. I think for starters, it's understanding. I think sometimes governors can be a little bit guilty of asking too much of their staff. We need proof of this, we need it to look like that. That's a tricky way of seeing it. We need it like this. Yes, you need the information you need, absolutely, and you can't just sit back and say, off you go and carry on. But I think one thing is to try and understand that use what your staff is using. So if you want to know about progress, use what your staff are using to see that, so you can see it too. Don't be asking for extra. And it's understanding. Make sure you're talking to your staff, that you're going to school and you're hearing their worries and their complaints, and well, not complaints, that's really harsh, but the things that they're dealing with. And I think if as a board you're making decisions and you're helping improve things for pupils, that's improving things for staff. It's, you know, with governors, we often meet in the evening. Don't ask your staff to come and present to you in the evening. Make the effort to get there in the morning. You know, just work with them. And I think speak to your leaders and understand that the issues that they're dealing with. And I think it's about being flexible and providing a simple framework for them to work from. I think it's if it sounds like a cop-out again, but if you go back to those core functions, if you go back to that, like, are we doing what we need to be as governors? Are we doing it right? Then you'll find you are supporting your staff. Be visible. You know, the governors, you can go in now. And if you can't go in, you can speak to them like we're doing here. So talk to them and understand, I would say.
Lovely, thank you. Ellie, you made some comments about parents being allies. Did you have any key examples about how we can do that? How we can do it well, I suppose.
I'm trying not to be on the negative side and coming up with the negative examples rather than positive examples. The positive examples is talk to your parents about what their children need and see them and talk to them as stakeholders. Parents are as important as pupils in your school. And if anything has taught us that, it's lockdown, right? Because the parents had to take over teaching and everything. And that was tough. So understand them, talk to them, ask their advice. I think quite often when parents are worried about their children and they want the school to help, and my child needs this and you need to put this in place for my child and all that sort of stuff, you can feel quite defensive as a leader to say, well, hang on a minute, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing for your child, and I know I'm doing the right thing. It's not up to you to tell me how to spend my pupil premium money, for instance, or, you know, all those sorts of things. And it can feel quite almost aggressive, and so they can kind of do this. And I've said, but you must talk to them because they are stakeholders. And if they trust you and if they feel they are heard, they will work with you rather than against you. And you know, any school knows you want parents that are working with you, not against you, because that's not a nice place to be for anybody. So I think it's almost like, I think as governors, when you come in from other industries and you know about customer service quite easily, schools don't know about customer service, and their parents are their customers almost. It's easier for us governors who come from completely different worlds to sort of look at it that way, but it's really hard to look at that for educators. And I think that's maybe a little shift that you could help gently.
Gently, yes. Thank you. We have a couple of other questions about early years in particular. So I'm coming back to you, Rebecca. I know I went in and did a reception monitoring visit and was quite surprised, I think, at the levels that the pupils are functioning at compared to previous years. If we don't have any more lockdowns, do we know how many reception years will be affected? Like going forward, I guess what we've got to think about is actually, this isn't just this year, is it? It's potentially next year, and how long are we going to be in that recovery mode for? And also, is there any attendance data around children attending children's centres or playgroups or preschools? Do you know any of that, Rebecca?
Yeah, so in terms of how long, I mean, I will say I don't know enough about very early child development, like very small babies, to know how much I'd expect for them to be impacted. But I think at this point, we at least are going to have this next September coming next year's cohort. I'd expect they're still going to have quite heavy impact, and probably the one after, I'm less sure about after that point. And again, it's going to depend, that point that's been brought up so well by others, of how much is this over and how long are we going to keep seeing disruption, and how much are some parents, you know, perhaps just being more cautious at the moment anyway and choosing to limit social interactions, and is that going to have an impact on those children? And I think a lot of that we don't actually know at the moment, so that's still an open question. And sorry, can you repeat the second part of that again?
It was around playgroups and children's centres, whether there's any data on that front.
So one thing we do know that's really concerning is that a lot of settings have actually ended up closing during the course of the pandemic. So I don't know anything on absolute attendance data, but if there are fewer settings in existence, then we do know that that means that that's because they weren't getting kind of the kids through, they suffered too much during the pandemic. So there will be fewer spaces for kids, so you will expect that attendance will have gone down as well.
Lovely, thank you. We have a question around the more able children. So thinking about the widening, I think there's probably groups that we would be surprised that had been negatively impacted. I think it was universal, isn't it? Everyone's had a negative impact, been negatively impacted. Is there anything that as governors we should be thinking about, particularly for those more able pupils, while we are obviously focusing on the disadvantaged and maybe those that were already behind and willing to catch up?
I think that's a really important point, you know, because it's almost too easy just to talk about recovery and catch up and all that kind of stuff. But yes, everybody was affected negatively by COVID, but actually for some pupils in some situations who had, I don't know, 2 parents who were able to work at home, juggle their time, had the equipment they needed, had the space to do it in, and actually had children that are really good at getting on with some work on their own and studying and enjoying it and loving learning. They actually did, you know, great. And the problems that they're having now is actually, now they're back in the classroom, coping with all the noise and the people and the lack of focus, and actually not being able to concentrate as well as they did at home. So, you know, you have got, and I think what we're talking about, and you know, we're looking at all this pyramid of needs, you're going to have people right up there at number 5, and you're going to have people right down here at number 1. And I think you're right, every child, Katrina says, it means every child. And yes, it does. So it is about looking at what each child needs, and whether that's pushing further and you know, and really going for it and making sure that you've got links, if you're a primary school, with the secondary schools, and you're looking at what they're doing, making sure that you've got staff that can cope with the higher levels. You know, quite often and that's the trouble, if you talk about attainment with your data, when kids sometimes get to a level, do you stop trying? Well, you'd hope not, wouldn't you, really? So you've got to have those higher level teachers that can cope and can push those those pupils further. So yeah, I think you are surprised sometimes about some of the issues you need to deal with. But again, it's having that open mind. It's about learning about who's in your school, and it's about learning what those individual children need. Every child means every child.
Rebecca, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'd say I largely agree with that. And I think that you are likely to see impacts for that group. Also, because a lot of the time it's wider enrichment activities and that extra push from the stuff they do in the classroom that's so helpful for that group. And obviously a lot of that hasn't been able to happen. I also wouldn't be sure that we don't have, as far as I'm aware, good data on this. If teachers are having to do all this extra work to try to deliver online learning when that was happening, how much they would have had capacity to add stretch tasks and things like that would have happened for more able students in the classroom. So I think that is something really worth asking about. I think, again, linking to how much pressure are you putting on the teachers? Do they have capacity for this at the moment? Maybe it's something you ask a little bit later. That I think that's going to depend a bit on the context of your school, but I think it's definitely something worth thinking about. I've also just popped in the chat, I did a report a few years ago looking at interventions that can specifically help more able children. So if you are looking for some inspiration or something you could send to your school on things that they could do, take a look at that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Excellent. Ellie, we were asked about the dyslexia friendly classrooms video as well, if we could have the link for that.
I can't give you the link to the video because it was part of our idea stream. So it was like a members of idea stream.
All right, okay.
But I will go and find the dyslexia friendly classroom thing that she was talking about and make sure I put it on. So
okay. Excellent. We will wrap up there. We've had feedback that going on to an hour is sometimes difficult if people have meetings straight away afterwards. So we will wrap up there. Thank you ever so much to everybody for joining us, and thank you so much to Ellie and Rebecca. Really, really fascinating stuff on such an important topic. We'll share the links, we'll share the slides, and we'll share a recording of the webinar to everybody who signed up. Thank you ever so much to everybody.